So in this video, we're going to be taking our sports nutrition AI assistant and we're going to turn it into an app in Flutterflow. So if you missed the video where we set this up in the OpenAI playground, that's going to be on the screen now. So I suggest you go back and watch that if you don't know how to do this with using file search, etc. But if you do, obviously carry on. But in the meantime, watch that and come back and catch up with this one. So let's get stuck into what this is all about. Okay, so in terms of the way this works, we have an assistant. We have a thread, which is the messages between the user and the AI, and then we essentially have a run, which is where the AI processes the information that's being sent. So the sequence we have is we create a thread, we add a message to the thread, and then we create a run on the thread, and then the thread will be in progress and eventually it will be completed. So there are a few other options to that. So our run is in progress and it can be completed, failed, cancelled or expired. So what we're doing in our app when we get to it, when I show you, it starts with in progress and then we are essentially querying the run until we get an answer. Now if it's completed, that's fine. And if it does anything other than completed, we just exit our loop that we've got in place. Again, I'll come on to this shortly. And essentially, if you're not using streaming, which we're not, you have to keep periodically retrieve the run object, which is what we're doing. So essentially what we're doing, we are creating a run, which is the AI processing the information we're sending it, and we're querying it periodically until we get an answer, which is hopefully completed. And then when it is, we're displaying the completed run, i.e. the messages on our thread in our app. That's essentially this in a nutshell. So if you bear that in mind, and we'll go into Flutterflow and we'll look at the sequence of events we need to do to make that happen. This is all being done with Supabase API calls because there are a lot of them. You need each one of the process steps in the OpenAI sequence. So creating a thread, creating a message, creating a run and retrieving the run are all different API calls. So unless you're on the Pro plan in Flutterflow, you can't use Flutter API calls, you only get two. So therefore we're doing all this in Supabase via remote procedure calls and the HTTP extension in Postgres. I'll go into all the code stuff later, but I'll just show you first off how we are structuring the app. So essentially we've got a list view, which is just contains some containers with our messages in again. So your UI, obviously, I'm sure is going to look much more complicated than this. And this is just a simple one just to demonstrate the functionality. We have got our query box. So essentially, write in your query to the AI in that box. You click the button and the button is where the magic happens. We've got 20 actions on that. And then when we start receiving responses from the AI, basically, they will show up in our list view. So the first thing we need is our assistant ID. So that is not the name you give it for short purposes. That is the actual assistant ID here underneath there. And in my instance, I have used a constant because we're only using one assistant. Once you've got this set up, actually having multiple assistants on the same app, it'd be pretty easy to do. You just need to change the assistant and then all the other step processes will be the same. So if you have multiple assistants doing lots of different things, calling different assistants within your app is actually going to be pretty simple, to be honest. But I'm just using one, obviously, and we've got that as a constant because it's not going to change. And then all the magic then happens on the button, as I say. Before we start, just actually go over this quickly. So what the bin icon does is clears down your current thread. So if you want to change what you're talking about with the AI, click the bin and it clears it. And we're doing that by simply resetting the thread ID value back to null, and we've got a page state which shows the thread or not, setting that back to false. And the reason we're doing that is because in our list view, we're generating the children via the response from a custom action, which is calling the thread content, and that obviously is null before we make a call. We've got a list view which is full of null values and you get the red error, so therefore all we've done is hide in the list view until such time that thread content becomes populated, and then therefore it shows. So in turn then the page state to show the list view to true, and then when we're clearing up the thread, we just turn it back to false. That's why there's the thread ID I'll come on to in a second when we're working through everything. So like I say, list view is conditional on whether the data for the list is actually populated or not. So on the subject of page states, we've got a few. We've got the thread ID, run status, the run ID. They're all related to information receiving back from OpenAI. We've got the show thread, which I've just explained. And then we've got the refresh, which is just the one that you want to refresh your view. Sometimes you need it, sometimes you don't. I tend to use it as a matter of course. That's it in a nutshell. And if we look at the actions on the button, there are quite a few. If I zoom out, it looks worse than it is. These two loops are essentially exactly the same thing. The difference between our two routes is this side is a new thread, so we are creating a thread and we are running all the actions we need to have the conversation with AI, and this side is identical except we're not creating a new thread, we're adding to the existing thread. So there's a lot of actions there, but in truth that and that essentially the same apart from creating a new thread. So before I run down the list of all these individual, I'm just going to run through the custom action code for each one. So we've only got to do it once, so we have to go over it over and over because we're all pretty much the same anyway. So let's jump in there. So we have to create a thread, we have to create a message, then we have to create a run, we have to get the run, and then we retrieve the thread. So they're the actions we have to take. They're all separate API endpoints on the OpenAI side. And the only one that's slightly different is retrieving the run, which I'll get to in a second. So as you can imagine, these are all standard remote procedure calls. If you watched any of my videos, you'll have seen this before anyway. So we are sending some information to Supabase and returning some values. In this case, we're not sending anything, so we're just creating a thread, but we're returning a string. And then we're creating a message and we are sending the thread ID in the message. The thread ID is what's returned from the creating a thread action. And then we move on and we create the run, which is the one that actually performs the task of running the query on the API side and sending us back the values. And you see in there we're passing in the assistant, which is the constant that we were discussing earlier, and then we're getting the run, and that's just checking if it's been completed or not. And then we're retrieving the thread, which is the one that's different. I'll go through this at the end because the information we get back from OpenAI is a nested JSON array, and we only need the role and the message. We don't need anything else in there, and this makes it simpler to extract it and pass it into our values in Flutterflow via a custom data type. So I'll come on to that at the end. So I won't need to go back over these again, hence why I went over them all in one go. So let's start running through the action blocks. So we're starting off, we're just checking if our text field that we're sending the query to is actually got anything in, because if it's not, it's empty. We are just going to give an alert that says you haven't asked the AI a question. However, if you don't do that, you don't actually need to do this, because if you don't, what the AI comes back with, it just comes back saying you need to ask a question about sports nutrition, because that's what the AI is sort of set up to query. So you don't actually need this, but you can put it in or not really. So yeah, so there is that. And then we're starting then messing around with some of the page states. So our run status, if you recall, these are the options. So basically, while it's in progress, we need to continue to periodically retrieve the run object until we get to one of these points. So, but in the first instance, because we're using a page state, we need to reset it back to null. So it's not been affected by any previous runs that we made. So that's obviously why we're clearing that. And then if the thread ID is unset and empty, so our thread ID is also a page state, and that is essentially what we get back when we create a thread. So, and the reason we're checking that is because if our thread ID is empty, we are creating a thread and then performing all the actions. Thread ID is populated, i.e. we've already got a thread going. We just keep adding to it. We don't create a new thread. Okay, so let's start on the API actions. I'll go through the docs afterwards. I think that's going to be, otherwise we're going to get bit confused. I'm just going to go through the super base and the sort of the actions. So starting off with creating a thread, and our action output is a thread, and basically if obviously we don't need to create a thread because we're already running a thread, that's fair enough, but then creating a thread we get a response, and the response is a text. So again, if you've seen in my videos, you've seen these before. This is simply the standard HTTP request I use as a database function. So we have to, as you can see, we're returning a text value, and basically what happens is the value that comes back from API of OpenAI is actually a JSON, as you'd expect it to be, but we don't need all the information it's getting. We only need, out of that information, the ID of the thread. So what we're doing, we are essentially taking the JSON response and we are assigning the ID value to the variable thread and then returning that variable. So all we're returning is that bit of text, which is the ID of the thread we've created. So we don't need all the other stuff. These all the same. We are pulling the API keys from the vault, and then we have got our API endpoint, the method, and the headers, and then our content is just blank because we don't need any content, because simply we are just creating a thread. We're not sending any information to the OpenAI API in this instance. So that's the create thread, and then the response, as you saw, there was a text, and then we're putting that in a page state called thread ID. The next thing we need to do is create the message, and so therefore we're sending the thread ID because the message has to be attached to the thread, and we're sending the value of the text field, i.e. the question we're asking the AI. So that is creating the message. That doesn't need an output because we're not receiving anything back for that. It's just take this message, add it to this thread, please. That's essentially all that's doing. So there, create message. It does return a JSON response, but in Flutterflow, we're just completely ignoring that because we don't need it. That's just the standard API response to say that it succeeded and all that kind of stuff, which we're not using. So we're ignoring that. Once again, we are pulling the API keys from the vault, sending in the headers, the endpoint, and the type. But in this instance, we are actually got some information we need to send to the AI, and that is the role, which is required value, and the content, i.e. the message we're sending. So the role is the user, and the message we are sending is the question we're asking the AI, and that's how we do that. And that is being then sent along with everything else by basically making the HTTP request there. So all this information is just building the HTTP request up, and we're executing it and receiving a JSON response that we're not actually using in this instance. And the thread ID, you can see there we've got a variable being passed in, which is the thread ID, which we're passing into the function and using that as a variable in the API endpoint, which obviously pretty critical if you need to identify a particular thread. And then we create the run. So what the run does is basically just gets the AI to run the assistant over the query we've asked and provide a response. So we send the thread ID, so that's the thread we need to run, and this is the assistant we're using. The assistant, if you remember, is a constant that we've got stored, so that's the same on all of these instances. And this is why I said that to swap around between different instances is actually going to be dead easy. You don't have to use a constant as a variable, or you could have several constants and you can just sort of conditionally choose which one you want. So running different assistants on one of these simple apps is going to be simple once you've got one set up, basically. And then in this instance, we return a result, and that is basically the status of the run, that being the status, one of the run steps. And then what we're doing, then we're updating a page state with the value of that. So create run, returning text, same again. The only thing we're sending in the request body is the assistant ID, because the thread ID is hard-coded into the endpoint URL via the parameter being passed in, and then at the end what we are doing, we're returning the ID of the run as text. So again, we've got a JSON response with a load of information in. We don't need any of it, we just need the ID of the run, and that's what we're sending back to Flutterflow. And then that's what we're passing into that page state there, which is the run ID there. Okay, so we've got a page state called run status, and essentially that's the one that we have cleared at the top and reset it back to null. And what we're saying here is if it doesn't equal completed, what we're essentially continue looping until it does. And again, that is referring to the run steps here and the different options that it can be. So obviously to start off with, it's null because we've reset it to null at the top of the list here. So we will start the loop, and then what we're going to do, we're going to get the run. So to get the run, we have to send the thread ID and the run ID, which we returned from when we created the run, and the thread ID obviously further up. And then we got a output variable I've called complete run. So what that does, if we go to retrieve the run, and again the run ID and the thread ID are hard coded into the API endpoint via the parameters that we're passing in, and we don't have to send any other information in the request body, but just the headers. And what we're doing at the bottom, we're taking the response, which is a JSON from the API, we're extracting the status and just returning that as text, because we don't need all the other information. And again, I'll show you why in a minute in the docs. And then what we do then is update this page state with the run status. So that will be one of those particular values, whichever one it happens to be: in progress, completed, failed, cancelled, or expired. And then we'll go to some conditions, because if you know anything about loops, I did a video on loops if you want to watch that. Basically, you need a way to escape loops, otherwise they can run on forever. And what we've got in this instance, because we've got so many options, if we just say, do we want it to be completed, and just go on that, so break the loop when it's completed, if your API returns anything other than completed, your loop will just continue. So even if your request had failed, if you've only set it to understand to break at completed, basically it'll just run forever. So what we need to do in the loop is have some conditions, and we've got 4. It's basically if it equals failed, expired, cancelled, or incomplete. And what we're doing then, we're breaking the loop. So if it equals any of those conditions, we're going to break the loop and end it. And then if it doesn't equal those conditions, we are going to have a delay. So what I didn't want to do is just continually ping the API. I'll just put a delay on it for 3 seconds, because the AI does take a few seconds to return its answer. So there is no sense in just pinging it constantly. So just give it a few seconds. So you only got to probably ping it 2 or 3 times before it actually returns with your value. And it'll go back to the top. And if it's not completed, it will run again. And if it equals completed, it will break the loop, basically. So you break the loop here if it equals completed via updating the page state. But if it equals any of those things, we're going to break the loop. So we start off with null. We get the run. We update the page state. If it's anything other than essentially null or in progress, because obviously we haven't got in progress in the conditions, we'll break the loop because that's failed. And otherwise we'll just continue the loop until the status is completed, and then we go and retrieve the thread. So for there, we are retrieving the thread ID, which obviously we've got in a page state at the top, and our output is thread content, which is the JSON value. So retrieve the thread and return the JSON. Again, all we're doing here is passing the thread ID into the endpoint URL via the parameters being passed in, and then there's nothing in the API request body, and we're just returning the JSON response to Flutterflow. And all we're doing then, we're showing the thread, setting that to true, so our list view will then become visible. And then clearing the text field, so if our user wants to ask another question, and they'd have to delete the current contents, obviously, that'd be terrible. And then we're just doing a refresh, which in this instance you actually probably don't need, but again, like I said at the beginning, it doesn't really make any difference anyway, so that's what we're doing there. So that is the action chain that powers this. So there's 5, I think, there API calls you have to make to get it to work. This side is exactly the same, except we're not creating the thread because the thread already exists. So that's the meat really behind this. That's actually what makes it work. So let's go to the docs before we test this out. Okay, so runs. Now, if you recall there, I just said about all we're extracting from the run object is the status. So let's head back just to go back to there again. So retrieve the run. We're just returning the status, and I'm doing that because this is the standard response. We're just assigning that bit of text there to a variable and returning that, because the rest of that stuff we don't actually need. Likewise, when retrieving a thread, we only actually need the ID. We don't need anything else, so we're just sending that back as a text object rather than having to extract it out of there in our app. So that's the reasons, sort of the thought process behind that part of it. Now, if we head back, okay, so when we're retrieving the thread, what are we actually doing? So if you remember, this is the one that would look slightly different. So the response we are getting back from the API is actually via the retrieve messages endpoint, and what we're doing is retrieving the messages within the thread that's been created by the run that we've done. And what you have is, this is a standard response, and buried in there is the role, i.e. the user or the AI, and the value, which is basically the message. Now, as you can imagine, if this is a long thread, there's going to be lots of them. So what we are doing, again, we don't need any of this information whatsoever, particularly because we're sort of filtering it out elsewhere, and the way we're making the requests. So we only want the role and the value. So what we're doing here is splitting out. So all we're going to end up with is a set of key value pairs, which is the role and the message. So we're splitting out the role and we're splitting out the value. So we end up with a set of key value pairs returned as a JSON. So all that's in that JSON is role message, role message, role message. We are removing all this other information to make it easier for Flutterflow to get the information out using a custom data type. So we have got a custom data type called messages, and what's got in it is role message. And in our text here, the values is basically custom data type. So our list view variable is called chat, and it's from the thread content. And if you remember the actions, which you can be forgiven for not remembering it all, obviously, thread content is the contents of our chat with the AI. That's what's creating the values in the list, and then we are then mapping those via a data type to the two text objects. So we just got role and message. Like I say, it's a very simple UI in this instance, but it just to demonstrate the functionality. So that's how it functions. It looks really complicated, and it actually is quite a lot to it, but once you've got it set up, it can be replicated quite easily, and it does really help you understand the OpenAI APIs and all these different endpoints. And there are some easier ways of doing it, I guess, because you can create and run a thread at the same time, for instance. But the link to all the docs will be in the comments down below as always. So let's now fire up test mode and show you how it works. Okay, so I'll leave the debug panel open so we can look at the different outputs when they arrive. So let's ask it a question. So if you remember, this is all to do with sports nutrition, so it's querying a JSON that we've uploaded to it to get the information. So ask the question, we're creating the run, it's all there in progress, and then that will change to completed, and then the information will appear. There we go. Now, again, in terms of UI, you probably want some kind of animation or something going on there. You don't want a blank screen because you usually think everything's broken. But that being said, the assistant has returned us the value, and we can add to this and ask it another question. So in progress and completed, and there we go. Now what I've done, I've got that scrolling, which obviously not the best idea, obviously, but in terms of responding with the AI, that is functioning as intended, and then we can clear it and then we can start again. You'll see this thread ID is now back to null. All this stuff would get repopulated with another request. So there we go, we'll do one more just to show that. And then new thread ID there, look. And we're back in progress. Completed. And there we go. So that's how it works. With UI exception, obviously that would need changing, but in terms of the functionality and all the different endpoints you need to make this function, that's it. So if that was of use, please consider like and subscribe, and I will speak to you in the next video.